Welcome to the final lecture of Josef Stefan Days. The whole week was very full of very exciting lectures and events. So the final speaker is Professor Tony Will from Dublin. He's into computational creativity research. He started his research career with a PhD in Dublin from Trinity College. It was about the subject of creative language processing. Then he was partially in academia, partially in industry, including PsyCorp Corporation, where some of our colleagues know very well about the psych ontology, and there he did some reasoning tools for that. Nowadays, he's professor at University College Dublin, and his research area is computational creativity. We were part of two projects together with Tony. One was Prosecco Consorted Action, where Tony was coordinator. The other one was WIM, the What If machine, where we both contributed to that kind of research. Tony is very well known for his work in computational creativity. He wrote more than 100 research papers. He wrote several books, some in comics form, and today's lectures will be in comics form, so this is slightly unusual, but I'm sure you will enjoy it a lot. His book in 2012, Exploding the Creativity Myth, The Computational Foundations of Linguistic Creativity. Then he's very much interested in metaphors, automatic metaphor creation, simile, analogy, blending, and irony. There is a forthcoming book in this year about Twitter bots, and he will tell you more about it. And of course, he was very active and still is active in the Association of Computational Creativity. He organized the International Conference on Computational Creativity in Dublin. And, well, he performs in summer schools on computational creativity. So we are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Nova. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's always great to be in Ljubljana. It's a lovely city. And thanks for coming to listen to me today. I want to talk about humor, because humor is one of the capacities that we humans have that demonstrate our everyday creativity. We think of creativity sometimes as being the preserve of special people, but everyone has a sense of humor, and we're all creative in a low-level way when it comes to humor. And I think the goal of computational creativity is not to try to replicate the creativity of geniuses, but to replicate the creativity of all of us in a way that we can create conversational and collaborative partners to make us more creative. Computational creativity is about creating creative partners that make the human in the partnership more creative too. It's about adding more creativity to the world. I want to talk about humor because I love humor, and jokes are really a kind of perverted metaphor. So I got into joke analysis and joke generation because I was interested in the conditions under which metaphors became silly while still being informative. Okay, so I'm going to talk about building a sense of humor from the point of view of a machine. Okay, and give you some examples of popular culture. This is K2SO from the film Rogue One in 2016. I think he's the best Star Wars robot because he's the only one with a sense of humor. We can presuppose that R2 has a sense of humor, but we don't really know what he's saying. But K2SO sounds like a really sarcastic human, the kind of person that you work with, perhaps, and that you enjoy their humor, but at the same time, you find them very difficult people. So here's a couple of examples from the movie. That is a bad idea, but what do I know? My specialty is only strategic analysis, so that's passive-aggressive. There's a problem on the horizon. There is no horizon. Okay, so that's a navigating joke. And two of the characters are meant to blend in as spies and steal something and get out without anyone noticing. But of course, there's huge explosions and people dying. And he says, there were a lot of explosions for two people blending in. So he's kind of difficult, but he expresses this frustration through humor. And he becomes a good team player, and we're very sad to see what happens to him at the end. Now, An interesting thing about K2SO is that in the film, he actually works for the Empire. He's an Imperial battle droid, and he's been reprogrammed by the rebellion, right? So they've taken something that was programmed to kill them and turned it into a collaborator. And we're told that the character Cassian did this, but he didn't reprogram the robot completely. He just changed the programming of the robot. So on the right here, this is my version of a conceptual blending diagram. We have what an Imperial battle droid is probably meant to be. Aggressive, ruthless, direct, no nonsense, right? And on the left, we have something like C-3PO, passive, helpful, informative. And what the characters in the film did was they took something from the right and they imposed onto it passivity, informativeness, and a sense of teamwork. And what you end up getting in the blend, of course, is passive aggressiveness. The physical aggressiveness of killing the enemy is now turned into passive aggressiveness, where language is used to verbally attack the people that he works with. So he is not designed to be humorous. This is my point. No one decided to give this guy a sense of humor. What happened is that his sense of humor emerged out of other characteristics. And that is what makes humor so difficult. We do not evolve a sense of humor. Humor is an emergent phenomenon that comes out of other faculties that we have for teamwork and socialization and for problem solving. Another example from popular culture, which I really like, is the robot TARS from Interstellar 2014, one of my favorite films. Now, the robot looks like a big slab, and it's a reference to the monolith in 2001. This film is an homage to Kubrick's 1968 movie. Now, TARS has a somewhat nicer sense of humor than K2SO, but he's still very sarcastic. And at one stage, Cooper, the astronaut, when he finds out that TARS has a sense of humor, he says, "A giant sarcastic robot. What a great idea." So he shows that he's sarcastic too. And TARS is very, very witty. I mean, he suggests at one stage that he's going to take the humans and turn them into slaves for his robot colony and so forth. And he tells them, "I'll put on a cue light if you don't know when I'm joking," which is also sarcastic. And then when he tells jokes, the light comes on. So he's aware of his own sense of humor. And in fact, later in the film, when he's being repaired, we find out that he's highly parameterized. Cooper says, "I want you to set your honesty to 95%, which means don't be absolutely honest, because absolute honesty can be hurtful." He says, "Confirmed. Set your humor to 75%. And he says, "Confirmed. Self-destruct sequence in 10, T minus 10, 9, 8. So he's joking about having a sense of humor by pretending to be in self-destruct mode. So Cooper says, "Let's make that 60%. And he responds with a lower quality joke. He says, "Knock, knock." So he's aware that 75% is associated with a sophisticated sense of humor, and 60% is associated with childlike humor, and he's making fun of that. So he has a meta model of what it is to have a sense of humor. He isn't just using humorous statements. He understands fundamentally what it is to be humorous. In the movie, he's an old robot, and the newer robots, Case and Kip, have faster processors, but they are not funny. Why is TARS funny? Because humor is not about processing speed. It's about experience of the world, and this old robot has seen a lot. Now, let's talk about a real robot, Alexa. Amazon's Echo with the Alexa interface. You might have noticed recently that there are stories about Alexa laughing inappropriately, which is kind of creepy. It's nighttime, and you're sitting at home with your wife, and you say, "Alexa, turn on the lights." And Alexa goes, "Hee." And then you say, "Alexa, turn on the lights." And she goes, "Hee." And then you say, "Alexa, for goodness sake, turn on the lights." And she goes, "Hee." But the lights don't come on. That is kind of frightening, right? Because you don't know what Alexa's going to do. Maybe she'll shut all the doors, turn the heating off, freeze you to death. So Alexa doesn't have a sense of humor, but she has a program for when to laugh. And because she doesn't have a sense of humor, the program for laughing is not very accurate, and she laughs inappropriately. And her laugh isn't very attractive. It's kind of creepy. So you can say, Alexa, please laugh, and you'll get the hee. And that's not interesting. It's not a real laugh. It's not a real smile. When humans smile fakely, you can tell from their eyes that they don't mean it. And she doesn't mean it because she doesn't really have a sense of humor. Now, what does it mean for a human to have a sense of humor? Well, let's take some software, Analyze Words, which analyzes people's personality on Twitter as exhibited in their text, and see what a funny account on Twitter looks like when analyzed. This is funny one-liners. Someone collects all of these favorite jokes and just tweets them. So this account is just constant comedy. And if we look at the Analyze Words profile, this comes out of the Texas group, James Pennebaker and his team, who came up with the LIWC. We find that the humor, the personality behind all of these collective jokes tends to be downbeat, moderately angry, not angry, but quite depressed, personable. Personable is defined by Pennebaker to be equivocal. When you're not stridently telling people what to think, but you're saying, I could be right, I could be wrong. You're opening the possibility of being wrong. Not at all arrogant, quite analytic, and very much in touch with one's feelings. Right, now, this is the personality of a self-deprecating person who sees the world as full of problems and goes, what are you going to do? Look at this. That's a classic form of humor. But comedians don't all have the same sense of humor, right? Some are arrogant, some are personable, some are upbeat, some are neurotic, right? Kind of Woody Allen style. So can we learn anything at all from human personality to build a computer personality that's funny? And you might think this isn't very useful. One of my students and I, we've built a neural sarcasm detector. It's a neural model, which means there's a lot of black magic. You just hook up lots of different components, convolution layers, pooling layers, recurrent neural networks and LSTMs. And you just feed in a network or a vector representation of a tweet, and it tells you whether it thinks the tweet is sarcastic or not. We found that we got a significant, statistically significant increase in performance when we fed in the personality analysis of the person who was writing the tweet. So if the tweet came from real Donald Trump, then we would analyze his personality using Analyze Words at the moment the tweet was generated. And the Analyze Words profile is built from the last 100 tweets. And by feeding in that personality, the system can better detect whether a tweet is sarcastic or not. Because we all know people who are very sarcastic. We say they have a sarcastic personality. Now, if you're in a bad mood, if you're in a sarcastic mood, your tweets are more likely to be sarcastic. So personality does count. But how should we model humor? I've been talking about humor now for 10 minutes, but I didn't tell you how to define humor. Can anyone give me a definition of what it is to be humorous? And don't use a synonym like funny. What is humor? The theories of humor that we work with in humor studies, and which have been around for hundreds of years, people find that a very funny phrase, humor studies. They must think, you guys have great fun studying humor all day. Let me tell you, it's not fun. The jokes are as old as ancient bread and just as tasty. People analyze simple jokes because no one disagrees about their meaning. But after a while, everyone forgets why the joke is funny. But the basic theory behind humor is that it is a form of incongruity. Incongruity is a sudden realization that the world is not as it should be. Okay, so you come to work and you look down and you realize that you're wearing two different shoes. You go, how did that happen, right? Or your car keys aren't where you left them, right? Or you wake up and you're not at home and you're in some strange bedroom. You go, what's going on? That's incongruity, right? Now, there are all sorts of incongruities in the world. You order pizza and the waiter brings you lasagna. That's incongruity. But not all incongruity is funny, is it? So what makes incongruity funny? Well, there are two minimal criteria. One is the incongruity must be resolvable, which means that you must be able to understand why the incongruity arose. So we call humor an act of incongruity resolution. And that view goes back all the way to Immanuel Kant, who said that humor arises when we are faced with a conceptual dilemma, and by thinking about it, the dilemma disappears into nothingness, and the relief and the joy that that gives us causes humor. It's kind of a sterile theory, I think you'll find, but it's a very useful one. The idea actually goes back to a Scottish philosopher named James Beattie, who came up with it earlier, but everyone credits Kant, and everyone since has been talking about incongruity resolution. And you probably came across a lot of incongruity if you grew up like me watching Star Trek, right? Or this TV show, Lost in Space. Did anyone ever see this? You're probably too young. You've seen it. I used to watch this every Saturday. And when I watched it, it was old when I watched it, I should say. We had this robot, B9. His name was B9, or as in benign. And his creator, Professor Smith. Smith was a wicked, selfish man. And he was always trying to get the robot to be part of his schemes. But the robot was always reporting him to the rest of the family, or saying, does not compute, does not compute. And in fact, this is the TV show where we get this phrase from. Whenever you hear people talking about computers saying, does not compute, it comes from this TV show. Now the comedy comes, this was quite a funny show. The robot is very rigid, not humorous at all. And Smith is not particularly funny either, but he's wicked. And the combination of the two of them, his frustrations caused by the robot and his reaction to the robot by saying, you boob, you idiot, I'll dismantle you for this, is quite funny. And lots of comedy acts work this way. We have a very literal-minded straight man, and we have what is sometimes called the banana man or the comedian. So Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, lots of comedy duos work where you don't have two very funny people. You have a very serious person who represents us, and then you have the clown who represents chaos, and it's the connection between the two that creates the humor. I'll give you an example of incongruity from Star Trek. In the early Star Trek, the Enterprise crew were always meeting supercomputers with evil intent, and Kirk always destroyed them by getting them to contemplate a contradiction. Now we know that computers don't work this way, don't we? When a computer gets a contradiction, it throws a Java exception, or it says, does not compute. But it certainly doesn't go, I must destroy myself, which is what happened in Star Trek. So here, Kirk gets this robot, which is actually like a flying teapot. You can even see the wire in the TV show. I am Kirk, the creator. You are the creator. You're wrong. Jackson Roy Kirk, your creator, is dead. You have mistaken me for him. You are in error. Error! Error! You did not discover your mistake. You've made 2 errors. Error! Error! Examine. It explodes. And he does this about 5 times over the 3 Star Trek series. Clearly, this is a false model of how computers handle incongruity. So if we think that incongruity is the basis of humor, TV shows tell us that computers cannot handle incongruity and therefore cannot be humorous. But that is wrong. I hope you'll agree with me by the end of this lecture that that is wrong. Humor, by the way, is probably the hardest thing that we'll ever give a computer. Everything else, making them drive around on their own, making them do shopping for us, making them write letters and books for us, easy compared to giving them a sense of humor. The sense of humor is the pinnacle of human development. Okay, so I should say that having said those high-minded words, most computer models of humor focus on the most ridiculous and annoying form of humor, the pun. Now, can anyone think of a form of humor that people actually apologize for when they do it accidentally? It's the pun. Have you ever heard someone say, pardon the pun, or excuse the pun? We are so embarrassed by this form of humor that when we do it accidentally, we apologize abjectly. Please excuse the pun, I didn't mean it. But computers are very good at puns. And early work in the 90s by Graham Ritchie and his students showed that computers could develop or generate novel puns that school children would find just as funny as the puns that were published in official joke books and in Christmas crackers. That's a really low level, right? What do you call a murderer who eats cornflakes for breakfast? A serial killer. Boom, right? Quickly move on past that. Now, if any of you are here because you came to see the Nobel laureate talk about physics, you might think, why does anyone care about giving computers a sense of humor? Well, there is a fundamental relationship between scientific creativity and humor. Isaac Asimov famously said, and I think very truly said, the most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not Eureka, Archimedes jumping naked out of his bath and running down the streets of Syracuse because he just discovered a way of calculating the density of gold and thereby saved his head from being chopped off. Eureka, the Greek for I discover, it's also the basis for the computer science word heuristic. It is not Eureka. That's the myth about science. According to Asimov, the most exciting phrase in science, the one that says, I'm on the verge of a big discovery, is, that's funny, right? The data does not meet your expectations. Kepler was looking at Tycho Brahe's data for the orbit of Mars for decades. He expected to solve the problem in weeks. He could not figure out why the hell Mars was moving the way it did. Eventually, he realized Kepler's law, that the planet was moving in an ellipse. And he said, what a dirty bird I was. He wasn't a very funny person, but you can see that he could see this sense that there's something funny here, and it took him 20 years to get the joke. But most scientists, when they see something odd, this isn't right. Consider dark matter. What the hell is up with the universe where most of the matter that seems to be needed to create the gravitational forces that we observe is not observable? Cue the discovery of dark matter. So, that's unusual, that's funny. That's the foundation for scientific curiosity. Some people go in the direction of jokes, some people go in the direction of theorems and scientific progress. But the foundational ideas are the same. Incongruity spurs curiosity, which creates either humor or science, or both. Okay, does anyone recognize this guy? This is a very local thing. This character's name is Victor Meldrew from a TV show called One Foot in the Grave. He's an angry old man, and bad things happen to him all the time. For instance, he's cutting a loaf of bread, and he finds something hairy in the bread, and he pulls it out, and it's a man's wig, right? Or he's eating fish and chips, and he finds something that doesn't look like a chip, and it turns out to be a man's pinky finger. Now, these are incongruities, right? I hope it never happens to any one of you. But it's not a funny incongruity until Victor says his catchphrase. Victor is very famous for his catchphrase. He looks at the incongruity and he says, I don't believe it! And that's the point at which everyone laughs. Now, why is it that we need him to say his catchphrase before the incongruity becomes funny? Let me ask you another question. Supposing you're sitting in this room on your own one night, just studying, catching up with email, and that clock falls off the wall. That's incongruous, right? Clocks aren't supposed to do that, but you understand that maybe the nail was rusty or something. Now, is that funny when the clock falls off the wall and you're here on your own? It's just weird, right? Now, supposing you're here with friends, you're having a study group, and the clock falls off the wall. Is it funny then? Yes, you'd laugh, right? You'd kind of, right? Now, why is it that the incongruity is funny when there are multiple people, and it's not funny when there's only one? Because humor is a social phenomenon, and it requires what psychologists call theory of mind, TOM. Theory of mind is this faculty that children develop around 2 years, where they can imagine what is inside someone else's head. It's a fundamental part of human cognition, right? And psychologists do experiments with children where the children see two people playing with a toy, and one of them puts the toy in a box, and the other child leaves, and when the other child leaves, the first child takes a toy out of the box and hides it behind the curtains. And when the second child comes back, the test subject, a young child, is asked, where will he look for the toy? Now, children about 1 year old will indicate that he will look for the toy in the box, or that he will look for the toy behind the curtain, because that's the last place he saw the toy being put. But children about 2 or 3 years of age will say he will look in the box, because that's the last place he saw the toy, right? So being able to put yourself into other people's minds and seeing the world through their limited access to facts is called theory of mind. And humor is all about seeing the incongruity through the minds of other people and imagining how they react. So Victor, I don't believe it! His frustration is humorous to us because we can step into his mind and see how he reacts. But without this catalyzing agent of the other person, without the theory of mind component, a resolvable incongruity is not funny. This makes it difficult for humans, for machines to be humorous, because they don't really have theories of mind or socialization skills. I would say that incongruity becomes funny at human scale. When it becomes about humans and we see it through the eyes of humans, the incongruity and its resolution become funny. And it's also to do with imagining how it feels to be powerful and to lose power, or to be powerless and to suddenly and momentarily be quite powerful, right? So lots of jokes cut the legs from under pompous people, and they elevate the weak over the strong momentarily. And that's a very primal force to us. Humor is a great equalizer. There's a certain form of humor called superiority humor, where we laugh at disabled people and so forth. It's a disgusting kind of humor. And in fact, Aristotle says that that's how humor works, that we laugh at the deformed and the weak and so forth. We do not. I mean, some people do, but they're broken people. We laugh when the weak are made powerful, when the incongruity is felt at human scale and social relations are temporarily upended. Okay, very important dimension. When you're modeling humor, you have to put aside the ugliness of some of the early theories. I'll tell you a joke to show you an incongruity. This is an Irish joke. I don't know if you've been to Dublin. The Guinness factory in Dublin has the biggest beer vat. It's like a big swimming pool of beer in the world, because they produce the world's largest amount of Guinness. And you can go do a tour of it, and you'll see people with nets cleaning the beer, because, you know, things fall in from the roof, kind of bird droppings and cigarette butts, and birds drop twigs and seeds, and people have to clean out the beer because it's a good beer. You want good quality beer. And one day, one of the guys with the nets falls in, trashes about. To cut a long story short, he drowns. It's a tragedy. And the manager of the factory says, oh no, that's Paddy. His wife has just had a baby. She'll be devastated. I better go around and tell her. So he goes around to Paddy's house, and Mary, the wife, opens the door and she's got the baby in her arms. Ah, hello, Tom. How's Paddy? And Tom says, she can see his face. He's devastated. And she starts crying. No, Paddy is dead, isn't he? And Tom says, yes, I'm afraid he is, Mary. He fell into the beer at work. And to cut a long story short, he drowned. And she's devastated. She's crying. She's scratching at the door. And then she says, give me some comfort. Give me some comfort. Tell me it was a quick death. And Tom shakes his head and goes, I'm sorry, Mary, I wish I could. But the fact is, Paddy got out twice to use the toilet. Okay, so this is what happens when an Irishman falls into beer. He drowns, but he drowns happily after a long fight, right? So this is the theories of humor that are dominant at the moment. The general theory of verbal humor, GTVH, which has its roots in the semantic script theory of humor by Victor Raskin from 1985, are AI theories. Raskin's SSTH says that a joke is partially compatible with two different scripts. You hear the text of the joke, and you activate in your mind this Shankian schematic script. But you get to a point in the joke where the script doesn't fit anymore and you have an incongruity. Oh my God, I've actually misunderstood what's happening. And then the mind jumps to a second script, and that second script resolves the incongruity, partially resolves it because the joke is still silly, right? We know that a man who fell into beer wouldn't really get out to use the toilet and then fall back in accidentally and do that twice. But there's an exaggerated archetype of the Irishman there. But this is actually the model. You have two scripts. One is dominant until you get to the punchline, and then you are forced to do a script switch or a frame switch. In conceptual blending theory, it's called frame switching or frame shifting, and in humor theory, it's called script switching. But the idea is that there are two scripts, one dominant, one minor, and at the punchline, the minor script becomes the dominant script, and there's a reversal of activation. It's a compelling theory, but in AI, we don't really know how to model these scripts effectively and how many there are. By the way, this cut up, I drew scissors here, is a generalization of a technique that was developed by William S. Burroughs and Brian Gysin in the 60s called the cut-up method. They would cut up poetry in newspapers and reassemble it randomly to get original new compositions. And it's a very prevalent technique. I'm going to plug my new book here that Nada was mentioning. Myself and Mike Cook have written a book with MIT Press called Twitter Bots, Making Machines That Make Meaning. It's a computational creativity book that is very practically oriented towards building Twitter bots, autonomous creative agents that have their own Twitter accounts and tweet for you so you never have to use Twitter yourself. I never use Twitter myself, but my machines are tweeting away all the time and getting me into trouble. And I've been banned from Twitter several times. Notice how the guy who drew this cover wasn't me. They just quickly looked at the text and came up with this robot legs, bird head. You see the mixture of fonts? It looks like a blackmail note, making machines that make meaning. That's the cut-up technique. It's a very intuitive and commonplace technique. And the script theory of humor, where you slice and dice scripts to create an incongruity that you can resolve, is the most common technique. And this suggests that, by the way, I drew a robot David Bowie there because he was very famous for using the cut-up technique as well. And he wrote some of his lyrics using the cut-up technique, like the Spiders from Mars lyrics. And in fact, he had a piece of software called the Verbicizer written for him to help him do cut-ups. There was no AI in there. It was pure, or what we call, mere generation. Now, this idea of cutting up and reusing old text, it doesn't please everybody. Very famously, in 1946, George Orwell, a brilliant writer, but a really hectoring personality, he famously said every joke is a tiny revolution against common sense and received wisdom, which I believe. But he also disagreed with this idea of reusing and cutting up familiar language. He said, a good writer chooses his words carefully, but the world is full of lazy writers who are ruining English, he said. You are not obliged to go to all this trouble. You can shirk it by simply throwing your mind open and letting the ready-made phrases come crowding in. They will construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you. He hated the idea of people using cliché and working with idioms in familiar language, when in fact, that's one of the dominant models for getting computers to be creative with language, is reusing familiar language and cutting it up in new ways. So, no to you, Mr. Orwell, right? In fact, he's a bit like Big Brother. If you read his work on his essays on language, he doesn't sound like Winston Smith from 1984. He sounds like O'Brien, and he sounds like Big Brother. In fact, he is what he hated in many ways. He would say things like, never use a metaphor or another figure of speech that you're used to seeing in print. This is a very authoritarian view of language that is not supported by anyone who actually studies language professionally. And it leaves no room for the creativity of reuse. I'll give you an example. There was a critic called William Empson of the same generation. He wrote a book called 7 Types of Ambiguity. And he famously criticized Orwell with this phrase. I really love this phrase. it may mean less to you if you're not a native English speaker, but he said, "Poor George, the eagle eye with the flat feet." Now, eagle eye is a cliche meaning sharp, sharp-witted. And flat feet means plodding, dull, banal, incompetent. So he says, basically, you can spot other people's problems, but you can't avoid them yourself, can you? And I think, notice how he combines two cliches. Very creative way of reusing cliches. And that's basically the computational approach that many of us take in linguistic creativity on a machine. We get the system to work with very familiar language, but we cut it up in ways that try to bring out novelty and incongruity. And we measure the incongruity and we filter the results by incongruity. Here's an example from one of our Twitter bots. It's called Trump Scuttlebot. He looks extremely orange on this slide here. I didn't mean him to be this orange. This may actually be more accurate though. And here's a simple Roses Are Red poem that the bot generates on its own. Bible Belt states are red, aristocratic veins are blue, my human children love me, and would lick dirt from my shoe. Okay, so notice how it's cut up all of these different phrases to make this poem that rhymes. And poetry generation is one of the areas that we study in computational creativity. But notice all the cliches. Bible Belt states, aristocratic blue veins, the idea of someone who's humble licking dirt from your shoe, and it combines them in ways that try to give new value to these phrases. And in fact, the system uses a grammar. The formalism is called tracery. I won't go into it here, but the grammar is built on all of these cliches which are written into the grammar. So for instance, up here we have all of the gold things that the grammar knows about. My underpants, Trump Tower toilets, Willy Wonka's ticket, Beyonce's toenails, and so forth. And it uses those to combine into these poems. But they're all given by us. So to be creative, the machine should really learn its own cliches and use them automatically. So we need to give the computer the ability to go out onto the web and to find its own commonplace, highly visual, imagination-tickling cliches. And we can find them on the internet and harvest them automatically. How do we do that? Here's an example of another famous comparison from one of my favorite authors, Raymond Chandler. He's the undisputed master of the simile. He wrote detective fiction, but he elevated into a literary art form. He's talking about a guy who's as big as me, maybe twice as wide, Moose Malloy, shockingly white. He's been in prison for 20 years. He's looking for his wife who ran away, and he's in the black area of town. Only black people live there. So there's this huge white guy, angry, running around, frightening all of the black people. And Chandler says this: even on Central Avenue, not the quietest dressed street in the world, Malloy looked about as inconspicuous as a tarantula on a slice of angel food. Angel food is a really white cake. Tarantula is a big, disgusting black spider. Notice how he's comparing a white man in a black neighborhood to a black spider on a white cake. This is not about visual similarity. It's about the ability to evoke a frightening image. You reach for that piece of cake. Oh my God, there's a spider. And he wants to give you that same feeling that the people who see Malloy have. And it works wonderfully. But notice that he uses the word about. In English, we tend to mark our ironic similes with subtle hints to say, I'm not serious. He's not inconspicuous. He's completely conspicuous. We mark our playful intent with the word about. And if we start harvesting as X, about as X as Y from the web, we can get all of these visual images automatically. And we know that they're playful because they've been taken from ironic comparisons. And we created an inventory, so the computer gets 215 ironic visual images for subtlety. Okay, as subtle as a train station toilet, right? Now, you see, that's a funny image, right? What's funny about that? It's just odd. We just love comparisons that are antagonistic and incongruous. as appealing as a trip to the dentist to have all of your teeth removed, right? Again, what a horrible visual image, but great fun, and so on. About as useful as seeking tips on humility from Donald Trump is one of the examples in there as well. So we use that, and we recombine them in the way that Empson recombined cliches to generate new cliches. Louis B. Mayer famously said, Hollywood needs new cliches, and we can build machines to give new cliches. So here's an example. It's kind of rude. I don't know if you watch Rick and Morty, but we've built a bot called Interdimensional Cable TV. It's called Intercable Bot. And it imagines what TV is like in other universes. By the way, it's really bad. It'll say, this art film is about as subtle as a loud fart during morning mass. And you see what a great composition of images. And what an unusual thing to say during Science Week. Here's a few examples from Interdimensional Cable. We now return to our addictive soap opera, Hell. We now return to our coordinated dance movie, The Dead Slug. Watch Mata Hari selling military secrets in the exotic spy caper, Cashiers at a Suburban Mall. The titles of the films are deliberately chosen to be the opposite of what they should be. Stay tuned for the next installment in the family film, The Priesthood Tree, the porn star, right? So again, it's imagining an idiotic universe where the films are not what they should be. And in fact, it's kind of a satire in Hollywood. And you can build these, you can reuse these images. We build them into a grammar. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and you can harness them for ironic and literal uses. So we have this little grammar that says 1,000 metaphors for Trump's America. And then it generates a number between 1 and 1,000, and then it puts in a visual image. And the whole idea, of course, is that it's meant to make you think newly about things. Does everybody know what a subpoena is? A subpoena is when a judge says, you have to testify. You're in big trouble, mister. Right? Turns out to be very apt. Let's hope. Okay, here's some more rude stuff. We have a bot called Comedy Dinosaur, and it generates a spoof of hipster culture. So, fancy going down to a new microbrewery, the Questionnaire and Magazine, for a pint of academic paper lager. It's the most boring name for a lager it could invent, academic paper. And the pub sounds dreadful, the Questionnaire and Magazine. Or, I've just been down my local gastropub, the Fart and Spacecraft, for a pile of horseshit. This is not a good gastropub, is it? Kids nowadays have their GPS, but back in the day, our only fun was changing sheets in a bedwetting clinic. Okay, so what we've done, in case, I'm sure there are lots of people are saying, what the hell is he talking about? We've taken the collective humor of the web as expressed through all of these imaginative similes, and we've deconstructed the similes and recombined them in new ways and new containers. So the first one is repurposed from a simile as pleasant as a fart in a spacecraft. And you imagine the confined space and the fact that the air isn't being recycled, and you go, oh my God, that's not pleasant at all. And then it says, let's name an English pub after that. English pubs are always named the X and the Y, the Lamb and Pony, right? The King and Queen, the Fart and Spacecraft, the Questionnaire and Magazine. Maybe this is a bit English. Okay. Groot may enjoy guarding the galaxy, but back in our day, our only fun was seeking out Donald Trump for tips on humility. Right? So you see how it's repurposing things? Now, the book I mentioned, the book on Twitter bots, the editor who commissioned the book said, Tony, she said this the day before Christmas Eve, Tony, we'd really like some of the reviews on the book to come from Twitter bots, just as a bit of fun, right? You know the way you look at the back of the book and it says, a tour de force, couldn't put it down, right? Stephen Hawking, something like that. Then couldn't pick it up. Anyway, sorry. That's not the worst thing I've said about poor old Mr. Hawking. Anyway, so they wanted Twitter bots to invent humorous, slightly sick reviews for our book so they could put them on the back of the book to show what you'd find in the book. So it generates things like, this moral new book about bots makes Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita seem as moral as the insect world, which is actually quite accurate, right? Because our bots have no morality, they're like ants. Or, according to Amazon, people who bought this valuable book about Twitter bots also bought F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Maya Stevenson's The First Edition of Genesis. This thing here, the bot imagines, what could be the most valuable book ever? Well, it goes to the similes and it says, as valuable as the first edition of Genesis, and it repurposes the first edition of Genesis as the name of a book, and it says, now that's a valuable book. And it knows that Great Gatsby is about this rich guy, he's valuable, so it compares them. You say, somewhere between the Great Gatsby and the first edition of Genesis. Really good pitch for our book, by the way. We want our book to be the kind of bot Genesis. So I'll end there by summarizing very briefly. What is it that we've done? Have we come closer to giving computers a sense of humor? Well, we've given our Twitter bots a sense of humor. And it's not a sense of humor for everybody, is it? But we've taken this idea of incongruity, this internal contradiction of ideas, which isn't funny in itself, and the idea that it could be resolved, which again is not funny in itself, and made it human scale by making it about certain kinds of people. Okay, so this is the kind of people who buy books on Amazon. This is the kind of people who enjoy technology. You have your GPS, but back in my day, we had great fun changing the sheets at a bedwetting clinic, which nothing compares to that. Or this makes fun of the people who go to trendy pubs with fancy names and drink bad beer and terrible food, right? So all of those approaches are really repackaging the visual images that are free to harvest on the web in huge quantities and says, how do I frame these in a way that makes them human scale? How do I make these be a negative comment on a certain kind of person that we can then laugh at or appreciate their response to? And in effect, what we're doing is trying to collect the sense of humor of the internet and package it in some discrete way, in some new context that demands a new purpose. This is not especially serious work. Humor is not an area that attracts Nobel Prize winners. You might find a few Ig Nobel Prize winners working in the humor field. But I hope I've left you, regardless of what you think about the computer's jokes, with the idea that humor is a fundamental human faculty. It is built pyramid-like on top of all of our other faculties. And it really cannot work on a machine until we've either modeled all of those other faculties or we've taken a shortcut and harnessed the collective human humor of the web, which is where we're at the moment, if you want non-pun humor. I would be very happy to take some questions or some criticisms or some bemused looks now. Thanks, everyone.
So when you have a state that does bad things, and if you don't know how to express it, and you start to use humor, so you make an association called the Banana Republic, and then you start calling all the officials and try to be serious regarding, hey, you're doing this job, but you're in a Banana Republic. How would you model reactions to the humorous aspect of solving a problem instead of using a war?
Instead of using
A war and military intervention.
Ah, okay, well, that's a huge question. I would say that our work is not really designed for preventing war. And in that sense, we're with almost everyone else in computer science. But I will say that I think your question arises out of the use of humor to diffuse interpersonal hostility. So people are arguing, and one of them uses a joke to remove the tension from the situation. Now, is it possible that you could elevate that to a geopolitical level? Well, the Americans elected a joke, and it's only gotten worse, right? So no, I would say that humor is dangerous in the wrong hands. And we've seen people who use humor to change people's minds and to turn them against immigrants or to turn them against people who are the other. So there are comedians who are liberal and they draw people in, and there are people who are reactionary and they push people away. Humor is a very powerful human force, and it can be misused as easily as it can be properly used. So I think if we were to try to use it for something truly serious, the chances of it being misused are as great as it being used. I mean, it's an interesting idea. I'll think about it and I'll get back to you.
Sorry, do you have a way to measure what's funny with a computer, like a neural net or something? How do you know what's funny?
Okay. That's a very good question, because we get funniness at a visceral level. I mean, sometimes something is so funny it hurts because we laugh so much, right? And I've been in situations like that where I can't stop laughing, and I'm thinking, oh my God, we say, I'm going to die. Some people say that when they're laughing so hard. Obviously, they feel it in this deeply physical way. So I was at an event in Oxford in November where a professional comedy writer got a bunch of his co-professionals. They write TV shows like QI and Mock the Week, and all of these shows where comedians are pretending to be spontaneous and to come up with a really witty joke. They've all been written 2 weeks earlier by this team of people. It was quite a depressing insight into the commercialization of comedy. And so half of the audience were professional comedy writers and half were AI people. And the goal was to make us talk to each other. We'd say to the comedy writers, what can we give you in terms of technology to make your humor better? And we wanted to learn from them. What can you tell us about the process of generating original jokes that we can turn into algorithms and knowledge representations? As an idea, it was great. As a reality, it was a terrible failure. The professionals didn't really have anything to say to us except computers have no soul. They have no body. Therefore, they cannot be funny, right? And we were saying to them, you've got no soul and you're funny, right? They didn't get the joke. But yes, they feel that embodiment is key. And humans use the laughter test. How much do you laugh? And comedians use that test. If a comedian was to stand up here and tell a joke and no one laughed, then the comedian would say, that's not funny. And in fact, the keynote speaker at this event in Oxford was Jimmy Carr, a very professional and quite famous British comedian. And he has this technique when he's developing a new show of writing all of his jokes down on a checklist and going into a small venue like a pub and testing the jokes. And when he gets a lot of laughter, he goes, Kch. And when no one laughs, he goes, Kch. And then he filters his jokes. And that's how he gets a stage show. You see these stage shows in a big arena and everyone's laughing at every joke? That's because all of the jokes that no one laughed with have been removed through this Darwinian process. Now, how does a computer substitute for laughter? It doesn't have a sense of humor. You're right. The sense of humor is mysterious. And whenever someone wants to model something mysterious in a practical way without actually deriving any understanding, we use neural networks. So you throw a neural network at it and you train it. And you still say, this works, but I have no idea why it works. I have students who do it. And of course, when you say I use a neural network, you have to ask them 100 questions to figure out what kind of network and what kind of parameters and how did they do overfitting and so forth. It's a really nightmare, black magic problem. So on Twitter, there's a simple solution. When the computer is generating its own original outputs, if people retweet it, you can tell that it's popular. Now, you can take the ones that have the most retweets and you can put them into a neural network model. so that the system can analyze its own outputs before they're retweeted to say, I think this joke will get so many retweets, this version of it will get X more, therefore I will use this. In fact, people at Cornell have been quite successful at predicting which version of a tweet will get the most retweets. They did it for party announcements. So they had different Twitter announcements of the same student party. And the system learned that when you mention free beer, that you get more retweets. That's basically what the neural network was doing. Free beer, no parents, open house, right? Swimming pool. If you just said, party at my house, we're going to watch documentaries. No retweets. Party at my house, parents away, free beer, swimming pool, chaos. 1,000 retweets, right? So you can get a neural network to learn that kind of thing. And so we're not immune to that. But that is no substitute for giving a computer a body and giving it the physical feedback of a joke. One of the comedians said, to be comic is to feel pain. Because when your joke fails, you feel this deep pain. You know, we say that the comic died on stage. And only when you have that fear and that feedback when jokes don't work can you really feel the joy when jokes do work. And that joy is addictive. And if you can train a computer to seek out the joy of telling a good joke and give it that feedback reward, then that is what we call a sense of humor, I think.
So you say that in humor oftentimes consists of incongruences and the possibility to resolve them.
Yes, the humor theorists said it's always incongruity based.
Okay, so yeah, my question was indeed, is there other ways to make humor?
Oh, well, there are many ways to be humorous, but the theories are consistent in viewing all jokes as being fundamentally about a violation of expectations. Now, this is problematic on its own. If you ever watch a TV show called Little Britain, it's a British comedy show where it's all about the same scenario every week with the same catchphrase at the end, you know exactly how the sketch is going to end, but it's your anticipation of how the people in the sketch will react when they hear the catchphrase that makes it funny. There was nothing surprising about the sketches in Little Britain. It's almost like a thought experiment. Can we make the most predictable show in the world and still make people laugh? And people howl with laughter. And the key to the jokes in shows like that is not the incongruity. The incongruity is present throughout. But what makes the joke funny is the theory of mind. You are projecting yourself into the mind of the person in the sketch who is hearing the sketch for the first time. You've heard it 100 times because you've watched the show every week for 2 years. But the person in the sketch, you imagine this as an innocent person being faced with this incongruity and being faced with this horror and having to somehow deal with it. So theory of mind is an underlooked element of humor. All of the theories look at the incongruity, but they don't look at the elements that make the incongruity humorous. It's a mystery, really. I think that missing component is theory of mind, our ability to empathize with the people in the story, which means that a computer that has a sense of humor is much closer to being a truly empathic machine, even if it laughs at us. I don't know what it's like in Slovenia, but in Ireland, we show affection to each other by humorously insulting each other, right? It demonstrates that we have the freedom to do this. We are so close, I can insult your hair and your shoes and your mother, and you won't get upset. And it's a sign of closeness, and it creates closeness. So empathy and humor are very closely related because of theory of mind. And I thank you for raising the topic, because by giving our machines a genuine sense of humor, we are taking them closer to being truly empathic and to sharing our value system. Machines that share our value system won't eradicate us. That's a good point, right?
I think we shouldn't take other questions because this was a very pompous end of the talk. Okay. More questions?
One more, maybe?
Hi. I have a question. If you know there's some analog of method to get people to laugh, like in situational comedy on TV, when the laughter is montaged into the video, when something funny happens, you hear laughter that is recorded.
Yes, it's called the laugh track.
Yeah. Is there some analog in written kind of humor, or like free beer in tweets?
Yes, thank you for bringing up that point. Here's an interesting thing about laugh tracks. If you've watched Friends or some TV comedy, and you know when to laugh because you hear this disembodied laughter and you imagine it is the laughter of the audience. And some of these TV shows are filmed in front of a live studio audience. So you imagine this is the laughter of the people watching the show as it's being recorded. In fact, you are hearing the laughter of dead people. These laugh tracks were recorded in the 1950s and are still used today. So you are hearing dead people laughing at situated comedies. But the laughter of dead people is still very effective. If you watch a sophisticated comedy with no laugh track, it can be sometimes very confusing. Should I laugh at that? Should I not? But if there's two of you watching it, you have mutual laughter to guide you. And again, it comes down to the theory of mind. Someone else finds this funny, let me find out why. And of course, if you watch a funny film like, let's say, Young Frankenstein, a hilarious film, we showed it recently at a spring school in Germany. Just having 50 people in the room laughing at this was complete joy, whereas one person would smile, 50 people are howling with laughter. Now, your question was, is there something that we can do at the textual level? Well, let's consider another subtle sign a less subtle sign is humor, or is laughter. A more subtle sign is a wink, right? Or a nudge. Some symbol that it's okay to laugh. Here, the about is the signal, right? So about as a word, it means proximal, near, but not quite, right? It's a marker of imprecision. And we use it in English, and I'm certain that in Serbo-Croatian, Slovenian, there is an equivalent marker. We call it a hedge. It says, don't take me at my word. I am being proximate, right? And it turns out that in English, we use this word to introduce our ideas when we're being very playfully ironic. And in fact, in some of the empirical work we've done, we've looked at automatically determining whether a simile is ironic or not. And the presence of about is highly deterministic. And if someone gives you a simile that doesn't have about, our system goes to the web and sees how many times other people have used that simile with about, and how many times they've used it without. If it's dominant in the about form, it is very highly likely to be humorous. Notice that Chandler doesn't need the word about here. He's subtly cueing you to laugh because he's going to give you something creative. Now, this is a really compressed form of laughter, but it's so subtle we don't notice it at a conscious level. Subconsciously, we pick it up and we say, he's wandering into the realms of the imprecise. I better hold on because it's going to be funny, right? And that's the detection of humor by neural nets or by statistical machinery is all about recognizing these subtle markers. It's not about recognizing that tarantulas are scary because the system doesn't know what that means in terms of humor. It uses words like about. It uses these closed class words, which is kind of cheating. But humans use them all the time to say, get ready, I'm going to tickle you with language.
No more questions. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you,
for
guys.
inspiring.
Thank you, Nadia.